Thank you. Now the slides. Excellent. All right. Tēnā koutou katoa o ka huhamahi a Tahawi. Hey, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to present at this conference. I'm based at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. I actually hold a split position at the university. So half of me belongs to the School of Science, where I run the work placement program, or the work integrated learning program for the whole school, that includes both work placements and the non-placement form of work integrated learning. And the other half of me belongs to the Vice Chancellor's Office, where I'm Director for Work Integrated Learning Research as part of our wider practice of work integrated learning. Now, Waikato University did something quite interesting in that we made work integrated learning compulsory for all the undergraduate students. We're the only university in New Zealand that's done that, and even on an international level, that's pretty unusual. But as part of supporting those activities, we created a central will unit that centralized some of those activities, where my directorship in work integrated learning research sits as part of the academic oversight across the practice of all of the university. Jesse's asked me to present on student experience in work integrated learning. And I thought, oh, that's going to be really exciting, because student experience is such a central part of work integrated learning and such an important part of our practice and our focus. But when I started putting the presentation together, I actually struggled quite a lot, because once you start looking at student experience, and particularly in the literature, it is an absolutely massive topic to be covering. In fact, much of the literature, if not perhaps all of the literature, is either directly or indirectly related to student experience, and particularly around the quality of the student experience. So rather than trying to give a summary of all of the work integrated learning literature, which is just simply not possible within 45 minutes or an hour, I will instead focus on some of the interesting insights of student experience that come through in the literature, but also within some of the practices that we have at Waikato University, that some of the observations that we have made. And within that, I'll throw a few interesting challenges out there as well, so hopefully those will be interesting and provocative for people as part of their thinking for work integrated learning. So look, as a bit of a background about work integrated learning, the term itself is an umbrella term. And it's been particularly useful in having an umbrella term to describe the activities that are fairly similar in intent and are similar in the intended learning outcomes, but are being described by different terms. In fact, the range of terms used to describe the different activities which we regard as work integrated learning is quite diverse, but also quite inconsistent. So it's been really helpful having a term like work integrated learning as an umbrella term. When Judy and Pretty and I were putting the International Handbook for Work Integrated Learning together, we wrote the chapter on defining work integrated learning. And it was a really challenging chapter to write, because we had to engage with such a broad range of literature. And we thought partway through, we thought for kicks and giggles, seeing we were so involved in the work integrated learning going through the literature, we thought we'll try and find the earliest mention of the term work integrated learning. So we dug deep into the literature, and we found that the first discoverable mention of the term work integrated learning was in 1995 in a refereed conference proceedings paper in South Africa on vocational education. And that particular article quoted the mission statement of WACE. Now, if you don't know WACE, WACE is the International Association for Work Integrated Learning, a really good organization to be involved in. We had a conference just recently in Sweden. I know some of us were present at that conference. It was a very positive experience. And WACE's mission statement was that by the year 2000, that they want to be the world leaders in work integrated learning. And that seems to be the first discoverable mention of work integrated learning, and quite likely WACE is the originator of that term. And it kind of lines up a little bit about the time I got involved in work integrated learning as well, which was in 1998, which I feel like doesn't seem that long ago. And I remember working with my colleague and mentor, Richard Cole, and he started using the term work integrated learning. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Where did you get that term from? I've not heard of that term before. And he said, oh, it's the Americans. They have come up with a new term, and it's going to be really big. I thought, oh, yeah, sure, whatever. And now look, almost 30 years later, work integrated learning is big, and it will continue to grow. So even though the term work integrated learning is new, well, it's been around for 30 years, so perhaps it's not as new as what we like to think, the whole idea, the whole concept of the student working and learning alongside the professional, the practicing professional, is not a new concept at all. Cooperative education, which was started by Herman Snyder in 1906, he himself identified that the practice was already in existence in both law and in medicine, and he borrowed the ideas from that. He was very open about that. The sandwich degrees, which is a UK model, 4-year degree, where the third year is a whole year in the workplace, that already existed by 1840. And we know that because there was legislation that came before Parliament there that mentions the sandwich degrees. And the modern practice of apprenticeships that we have today, the origins of that can be traced back all the way to Imperial Rome. So the whole concept of the student learning alongside a practicing professional is not a new concept at all. So why is work integrated learning expanding so rapidly across higher education? And we need to look at the two generally regarded purposes of higher education in society. Education for the betterment of society, and education as a means to increase productivity. Now, if we look at education for the betterment of society, literature tells us that work integrated learning is highly engaging and it is transformative for the students. And for those of us who are involved in running work integrated learning program will identify just how positive of an experience work integrated learning can be for students. And I think many students will identify that work integrated learning was probably their highlight moment of their degree studies. The literature also tells us that work integrated learning enhances and it deepens the student learning experience. And that's not surprising. Students are applying their taught concepts, their theories that they've learned, and putting that into an applied practice in an authentic setting. So it will certainly increase and deepen their understanding. And literature also tells us that work integrated learning develops critical and reflective and creative thinkers. And we need more of those in society, especially of late. But it's education as a means to increase productivity that is driving the growth of higher education, of work integrated learning in higher education. Government is by far the biggest investor in higher education. And governments it doesn't really matter what flavour government that we have at the time, they're very focused on the economy, especially of late. And increasingly governments are running governance like a business model. So they want to see a return on investment. And the return of investment that government looks for is increased productivity in the economy and employment. Now, I don't think there's a single article being published in the International Journal of Work Integrated Learning at the moment that does not mention employability somewhere in the article, because it's just so central in our practice of work integrated learning. We do need to be mindful that when government talks about employability outcomes, they usually mean employment outcomes. And it's not quite the same. One will lead to the other, but we've got to be careful that we keep that discussion as two separate forms of discussion. So what are some of the general observations that we can make in the literature? Well, first, work integrated learning for students' experience is very diverse, broad, and varied. And that's actually one of the big challenges that we have in work integrated learning. It's not like learning on a campus environment where we can control the dimensions around the context. We have consistent expectations of what the students be doing. We get expectation around the task and also how to be measured. That's not how work integrated learning works. We have students, particularly on the work placement model, that will be in different workplaces with different supervisors doing different tasks and different expectations. Now, that's also one of the reasons why work integrated learning is such an interesting space, because it is so varied, but it also presents some challenges for us. The other observation to make is that the work integrated learning literature is very focused on student experience, and it is overwhelmingly positive. Now, I make that both as an observation and a critique at the same time. Yes, work integrated learning is overwhelmingly positive. There's no question about that. But there are some less positive effects around work integrated learning as well. And I'll talk about some of those within my presentation where we talk through some of those challenges. But it's important to be mindful that we do need to remember to focus on some of the more challenging aspects as well. So where does work integrated learning, or where does student experience sit within the relationship of the three stakeholders? We will all have seen this diagram many, many times before, and we would have used the diagram many times as well. And it's probably one of, if not the most well-established diagram within the work integrated learning literature. In fact, it predates the work integrated learning literature. It comes from the cooperative education literature from last century. And I'm fairly sure that a diagram of this nature was probably in existence at the time of Herman Snyder. And if that's the case, that means this diagram has been around for more than 100 years. So very well established and obviously very well accepted. And it's a representation of the nature of the relationship of the three stakeholders that are here as an equal partnership. Now, what equal looks like is a little bit complex because each of these stakeholders have different priorities and different needs, but whatever complexity that might be, it is an equal partnership for these stakeholders. And it's also not hierarchical. Now, I put students up the top, and that's probably my own bias coming through, but we could easily have university up the top, or we could have workplace listed up the top there. Now, I think we can all agree that's a good representation of the nature of the relationship of the three stakeholders, right? Yeah, I see noddings of the head and a little bit here and there. It's good, that's what I wanted. I want to challenge that. Is that really an accurate representation of the nature of the relationship of the three stakeholders? I'm going to say probably not. And the reason it's not is because of student experience and the significance of the student experience. And I'm going to draw from the work from Jenny Fleming. Jenny Fleming is a New Zealand work integrated learning researcher. She's published widely, she's cited widely, and she's done a lot of research in external engagement, particularly with employers. And she did a large research project looking at academics' views, academic supervisors' views on the nature of the relationship of the three stakeholders, and also the student views. And when we looked, and she created a visualization of the nature of the relationship as viewed by the academic supervisors, you see here a slightly different layout. There's still that triangular aspect to it. You can still see that coming through. But now students sits at the top, and it has to be up this top. And from an academic's perspective, from a university's perspective, the bulk of the interactions are facilitated by and through the student, and not so much directly between the university and industry. Jenny's work at the time used the word industry. We can use the word workplace just as easy. So here, all of a sudden, the student has become the key player within that relationship. And once we look at the visualization of the student's perspective, it looks like this over here. Now, we can make a couple of observations here. First, the nature of the relationship has now got a whole lot more complex. There's a lot going on within that particular diagram. The second observation to make is that the student has put themselves center within that relationship. Now, you could argue it's a little bit student-centric thinking, and perhaps there's a little bit of that coming through, but the student definitely sees themselves at the center of that relationship, and that there is the bulk of those interactions between the stakeholder, of all of the stakeholders, is occurring through the student, but only a little bit of interaction between the stakeholders directly. The other interesting observation to make is that here the student has separated the academic supervisor from the university. They see those as two separate entities. And the interaction between the academic supervisor and the university may be in part the mediating of academic supervisor within the wider entity of the university and what that may be. So once we start looking in detail about the nature of the relationship, we find that the student and the student experience dominates that space. Now, it's not to say that the previous representation is inaccurate. I think that still has a role to play. It's still a useful diagram, but it's definitely an oversimplification of what that nature of that relationship is. Now, the literature talks a lot about the benefits of work integrated learning, and I'm not going to unpack all of these because they've already been mentioned within the conference already, and a lot of these are well accepted and understood. The slides will later on be shared. I've got some citations within there as well, so you can look up those references if you do want to read further around these particular ones. But I want to throw a little bit of a challenge around the employability outcomes as a benefit of work integrated learning. I mean, it's the one that is most often cited and probably the most often acknowledged. We need to be mindful that all of curriculum should be improving and enhancing employability outcomes. It is not just work-integrated learning. And sure, work-integrated learning is very visual when it comes to enhancing employability outcomes. The students are applying their taught knowledge into a context of practice, so it is very much in that space. But all of the curriculum should be enhancing student employability outcomes. And the challenge that I want to throw out there is that if there is a component in the curriculum that is not enhancing the employability outcomes of a student, we should question why we still have that in the curriculum. I was a little bit out there, and I know some of my colleagues at my own institution would probably challenge me on that, but I would like to think if you take a fairly broad view about employability outcomes and that we are preparing students for the future workplace, then all of the curriculum should be contributing towards that. And we need to challenge the parts that are not. So let's look at some of the more interesting or more different aspects of the student experience rather than perhaps some of the more obvious ones. And one of the areas I want to focus on is the study focus. Now, often a cited benefit of work-integrated learning is the career clarification that students get as part of their experience, whether it be work placement or non-placement forms of work-integrated learning. As well evidenced in the literature. I've done research on this area myself. It helps students clarify their poorly developed, the stereotypic and even misconceptions around the work. So there's no doubt that career clarification occurs. But something that is not often talked about in the literature is that students also gain study direction clarification. And we have a really good example at our institution at Waikato University that we often cite because it's something that occurs year after year and it's been happening for a long time. And that is with the environmental science stream within our science placement program. So we have students going on environmental science placement. They often go to a regional council, and the regional council for us is the entity, the governmental body that is in charge of monitoring the environment. And environment monitoring is a big deal in New Zealand. And those students often engage in having to use a platform called ArcView. I'm not sure if you know what ArcView is, but it's a platform that uses GIS, remote sensing aerial photography. It allows for layering of data around a particular area. It's a very powerful tool and widely used in environmental science and environmental monitoring. And GIS as a subject is not taught within science. For us, that is located within geography, which is on the other side of the university, and there's very little interaction between the two. And what we've been finding for years is that students who've gone on environmental science placement would come back for the final year of study, and they change their enrollment. And what they do is they enroll in the GIS paper on the other side of the university because they have found that during their experience in the workplace that that was a particularly important skill that they should have when they graduate. So it's a good example about how work-integrated learning is giving study direction clarification as well. We also had another interesting scenario at the university, it's going back quite a bit, no longer occurs, thankfully, is that there was a concern by staff within the School of Science, particularly the older staff back at that time, that high-performing academic students, if they go out into work placement, they'll likely be offered a good job opportunity. And if they do so, they are not going to come back and do graduate studies. And what we had happening was that these staff were actively counselling students out of doing the work placement program. It's astonishing, but it was wide practice and it frustrated us a lot, I have to say. We thought, look, let's address this issue with using research. So we researched and we found a number of things. One was that students who went on work placement went on to do graduate studies at the same rate as those who didn't do work placement, so there didn't appear to be that effect happening. But when we dug deeper, we found that students who do work placements were using that information in order to make choices around their graduate enrollment. And there were two elements that were occurring. One is that students who were placed at a research institute, they would discover that they actually really enjoyed research. And that was a reason why they went on to study master's level, because he ended up doing research at master's level. And that was actually incidentally the pathway that I took when I went through as a student. The other thing that was happening in students who weren't placed necessarily at a research institution, they were placed in like an environmental monitoring organization, and they were identifying roles that they hoped to have later on in the future. And they identified that a lot of those roles were held by people who had graduate qualifications. And that then became a catalyst for them to enroll in graduate studies. So work-integrated learning can not only inform study choices, it can also inform choices around graduate enrollment as well. And it's important that we acknowledge that and allow that to happen, because it's estimated of now that graduates entering the workplace that they'll have between 5 to 7 career changes within their working life. And that's career changes, not job changes, career changes. So that means the future workplace is going to be very dynamic and very fluid. And it's important that we prepare our students as best as we can for that interesting future. Now let's have a look at authenticity. Authenticity of the work placement experience, or the work experience, is part of the definition of work integrated learning. It's particularly important that students engage in real tasks and that they are meaningful and that they have a purpose in the activity. It's part of the definition. And research tells us that students value the nature of applied learning, not just in work integrated learning, but in all forms of experiential education. But we've got to ask the question, a provocative question: do they really value the authentic nature of work integrated learning? Now, I'm going to say, yes, they do, but maybe not as much as what we realize, or rather not as much as what we think. And I'm going to draw from the experience that Peter Kowalski and myself had during 2020, during COVID, one wonderful time. Peter ran the work placement program for engineering. I've always been closely involved with that. And as part of the accreditation requirements is that engineering students do 2 work placements. But during the COVID period, that accreditation requirement was reduced to 1 placement. But we looked at that and thought, you know what, we're well placed. We should try and aim for 2 placements anyway. So we carried on, charged ahead, and by and large, we were able to secure students that 2nd placement anyway, but there was a cohort of students left over. And they were mostly international students, so there were probably some other things going on as well. So we created a special project for them. And that project was to come up with a water filtration device that can be made using locally sourced materials in the tropical islands. And the idea here is that students will develop various prototypes of a filtration system, and then the best one of those we will then going to build into a life-size one that we can send off to the tropical islands into a remote region where they had a real need for clean drinking water. A really cool project. The work was real, the need was real, the external partner was real. We had a consultancy company involved a bit as well, and the community was real as well. So we had the Polynesian community come involved with this project too. But partway through, we realized that building a life-size product, that real authentic product as an output, simply wasn't feasible. It was probably beyond a bit too optimistic of what it is that we could do. And at the end, we did some research around what the student learning experience was within those projects. And including asking questions about that we couldn't do that last final step. And they told us a couple of really interesting things. When we told them that we weren't going to be able to achieve that final product, they said that it changed the way they looked at their project. And it also changed the decisions they were making. And it was a really interesting change that we're doing. So they said that because there was no longer that authentic output, they were willing to take greater risk in their prototype designs because they were less concerned about it not working. I thought, well, that's a really interesting observation. So students do have a fear around not being successful within an authentic context. Or rather, they fear the authentic consequences of not being necessarily successful at what they do. And within our well-being research that we've done, we know that the authentic nature of the workplace and of work integrated learning can be a source of stress for students as well. Now, that's not an argument that we shouldn't have authentic outcomes. I mean, that's part of work integrated learning, but it does mean we need to look carefully at how we lead students into that space, how we prepare them, and we probably need more scaffolding across the curriculum, so staged experiences where work placements might be that final experience that they have. So let's have a look at the complex nature of the workplace. Now, research has shown, and I'm sure many of us are aware, students tend to have idealistic views about how the workplace functions and how activities occur in that space. Matthew Campbell and I, we did some research around professional identity development, or particularly around ethical agency of students. We had a real interest in values education and wondered how we could build that into work integrated learning. And we gathered some views from students before work placement and views after work placement. And one of the questions we asked was, how likely is it that you'll speak up if you saw unethical behavior in the workplace? And what we ended up finding was that after the workplace, they were less likely to speak up if they saw unethical behavior in the workplace. And we looked at it and thought, yeah, no, we must have something wrong in the data. So we went back to the data and had a look, and no, the data was correct. Students are less likely to speak up against unethical behavior after a work placement. And we were baffled that we kind of scratched our head and thought, well, are we causing harm with students doing work placements? Are they more accepting of unethical behavior? This is not what we want. So we went on and we did some follow-up interviews with students afterwards, and we got a better understanding about what was happening. And what was happening is that students had a fairly uninformed view about the nature and the complexity of the workplace prior to going to the workplace. But while they were there, they were encountering the complexities, including the power differentials. And in particular, the student is at the bottom end of that power differential. And they also encountered that ethics is actually not as simple as it seems. It's not necessarily black and white about what is right and wrong. It is actually much more complex. And it definitely is not always black and white. There's a whole lot of gray that sits in there. And once students encountered that particular complexity, they came up they settled on a more realistic view about their chances or their likelihood of speaking up if they saw unethical behavior. So work placements and the experience that students have gives them a better understanding of the complexities of the workplace. And we need to also talk about well-being. Well-being is a really big topic in society generally at the moment, which is great because we've got to do a whole lot of work around that. But we also know that it's particularly challenging for students in higher education. Students in higher education generally report mental health issues at a higher rate than that of the general population. And that's perhaps not surprising. These students are shifting from a guided learning environment to a more independent learning environment. They're taking greater responsibility of their own finances, or lack thereof, and also greater freedom of choices that they can make and the consequences of that as well. But once we add work integrated learning to that, we're actually adding additional challenges to this further still. And there's been a number of people who've done research in the space. We're doing some research on that at the moment. Kath Hay and Jenny Fleming is. Dave Drury's done research in this area as well, identifying some of those stresses that students encounter, including, for example, particularly with work placements, that they have to apply for a position and they may be rejected. The expectation, as mentioned already, the reality of the complex nature of the workplace is a source of stress for them. There are definitely some challenges around inclusion in the workplace. Jacqueline McAway and Angelique Goldman have done some great work in that space, so I encourage you to look up their work. Financial hardship, and I'm going to come back to that very shortly, and even just the stress of the hours of work. And often for these students, this is the first time they've had full-time work, and they struggle with that part of it. So we need to acknowledge that work integrated learning can be stressful and perhaps even in a harmful way to students, and we need to manage that particular part. Here's a snapshot of the research that we're currently doing at University of Waikato. We're still working our way through the data, but this is a pretty good representation of what's happening. And we asked students to what extent they encountered a particular stressor. And you'll see two columns there with the slight to severe. That means anywhere between a rating of 1 to 10. In other words, they've encountered this stressor in some form or another. And perhaps a slightly more useful category is the one in brown, and that's the moderate to severe stress. So that's 5 or higher. So this is the stuff that might keep a student awake at night. And all students encountered at least some stress during their work placement, but 83% of students encountered moderate or severe stress from somewhere within of the stresses during their placement. That is a high number. That is quite a high number. And once we unpack that, it was financials that was the main source of moderate to severe stress that students encountered. Now, within our data set, we have both paid and unpaid placements, and I'll separate that very shortly because there's some really interesting insights around that. Physical health was a source of moderate to severe stress for half the students. The health of or needing to care for a family member, a third of the students were moderately and severe stress around that. And that's actually higher than what we thought. So there may be some other things going on in that area. COVID-19 was a source of moderate to severe stress for a quarter of the students, even back then. And we think this might be an artifact of that the bulk of the students, the largest cohort of the students, were trainee teachers, so they were going into classrooms and had a high level exposure. So we think there's a bit of an artifact coming through there. And even during work placement, the state of the world was a moderate to severe stress for about a quarter of the students. Now, we collected this data after the Ukraine war had started, but before the Middle East situations occurred, and I'm pretty sure if we ask that question today, even given some of the more recent events, we're probably going to have a higher number within that area. Now, the way we run our work placement program is not particularly different than it is at other universities. So I'm quite sure if this research was repeated elsewhere, you'll have very similar findings as well. We also found that students had some negative behaviours based in response to stress. And that includes that more than half of them reduced active lifestyle. They reduced contact with others, which is a considerable concern. That's often their source of support as well. And then they reduced their healthy eating habits. And 15% increased their alcohol consumption and smoking and vaping. So the whole concern about physical health and then having some of those negative behaviours, there is a bit of a vicious cycle occurring in that area. Now that leads naturally to the paid versus unpaid. And I know this has come up already. I think Judine covered it yesterday in her keynote as well. There is really some significant challenges sitting in this area. Unpaid placements is common practice in social work, in nursing, and in trainee teachers, but it's common in some other areas as well. Now, the literature's got some interesting insights. First, the literature says that payment makes no difference in the meaningfulness of the placements. And actually, we found that in our own research as well, but I think the picture is actually more complex than that. Because McHugh went on to do research where students had experienced both unpaid and paid placements, and all of a sudden those students did identify a difference between the two of them, and not surprising that they favoured the paid placements, of course. And there's a well-accepted argument that payment changes the nature of the relationship between the student and the employer. It amps up the expectations and likely amps up the level of support the students have, because now the employer is investing into that relationship and the student will be investing back into that by coming up with a productive outcome. The literature also says that students on unpaid placement experience significant financial stress. Well, that's not at all surprising, but interestingly enough, the literature also mentions that there are students who are giving up paid part-time work in order to complete the unpaid work requirements. And that is particularly a problem when those unpaid workplace requirements are compulsory components within their degree. In other words, they have to do them in order to graduate. So there are some huge issues. Our research found that unpaid placements, those unpaid students felt less supported by their hosts. Now, they still felt well supported, so it was a positive number, but students who were paid felt much more supported by their hosts. Unpaid students, they were much more reliant on support from all sources, so from peers, from family, from workplace, university, but also some of the more formal structures around support. They felt less satisfied about their well-being. In fact, it was less than 50%, so generally speaking, students on unpaid placements were dissatisfied with their well-being. They had greater financial stress, of course, and they were also they had a greater stress around the health or caring for a family member. And what we think is going on here is that students, in our case, it was teaching and nursing, they were unpaid areas. Those disciplines are likely to attract students who are more caring in nature, because that is inherent within those particular disciplines. There's literature to support that thinking. Those very same students are more likely to care about the health of family and also more likely to be caring for a family as well, a family member as well. So if we unpack some of the data a little bit further around paid and unpaid, we asked students in paid and unpaid about if they encountered financial stress. And 100% of the students said they encountered, unpaid students said they encountered some financial stress. Now, we cannot be pretend to be surprised about that. But 80% of the unpaid students said that it was moderate to severe stress. Now, that is a really big number and should serve as a big red flag for us. We went further and we asked students if they needed support for their well-being during their work placement. And 26% and 27% said they probably or definitely needed support for their well-being during their placement. Now, there's two observations to make over here. One is there was no difference between paid and unpaid in this particular case. 26%, 27%, it's the same thing. But the other is that 26, 27%, that is a large number of students who probably and definitely needed support for their well-being. And again, our placement program is no different than other placement programs. I am sure if you ran this study at your own institution, you'll come up with very similar numbers. And of the cohort that probably or definitely needed support for their well-being, we also asked them if they found that support. And 67% of the unpaid students said no, and 50% of the paid students said no. And again, this serves as a real big red flag for us. Now, we did have a follow-up question again that included asking why they didn't find support when they needed support. And most of the students didn't answer that question, which in itself is an interesting observation. But the ones that did mostly alluded to not doing so out of choice. And what they often end up saying was things like they just knuckled down, or there was phrasing of they sucked it up and got on with it. And okay, for a short stint, for a finite moment of time, you could probably push your way through a stressful moment and suck it up and get on with it. But if it's an extended period of time, sucking it up and getting on with it is not a healthy way of managing your well-being. So we've got some bad behavior or undesirable behavior happening within our students. And there's also the view that came through that seeking help might be a waste of time, that we're not convinced that the help that might get would be helpful. But we do know from our own data the ones that did seek help and got help found it to be helpful, so clearly it does work. So we've got an information issue sitting around in here. And then there were also some challenges around the availability of time. The students that didn't have time to seek help, or they found it too difficult to seek help from the university because they were on work placement and they were more remotely located. So we've got some work to do here when it comes to student experience. Now, I've couched this as paid versus unpaid. We actually collected data around whether or not they had alternative remuneration as well, because we have different models of funding students. There are a smaller cohort of students, and alternative remuneration can mean a range of things, from study award, which is almost the same as paid wages, all the way through just costs covered. So that's a low level of remuneration. And whenever there was a difference between paid and unpaid, alternative remuneration kind of sprinkled in between. So that tells us that even a little bit of remuneration at least makes some difference. But we have significant challenges, and I honestly think the time is right for us to really challenge the practice of unpaid placements. It's got a lot of profile in media, government's paying attention to it. There's a lot of research happening in the space, especially in the social work area. There's a lot of research being published around that. We need to be challenging the practice of unpaid placements and look at the very least of providing alternative remuneration for these students. I know Australia's made some decisions around this just recently. They are offering a stipend. It's not a huge amount, but again, it makes a bit of difference. So going from one big topic straight into another big topic, and that's equitable access to work placements or work integrated learning in general. Now, equity has long been a challenging area in higher education, well acknowledged, but we certainly have some equitable access challenges within work integrated learning as well. And there are some particular ones. The one I want to highlight, not that this is the only one, is the model that's reasonably common across many universities, and that is find your own placement model. And the argument is, well, that is what the real world is like. So when you graduate, you're going to find your own job. So, good luck, there you go. But it's not a particularly equitable approach of running a work placement program. There will be some students who have great social capital and will be able to access opportunities that other students will not be able to do. They might have Uncle Bob who runs a company who happens to be in the same area as their own studies, and that Uncle Bob will no doubt create a great placement opportunity. It will be a high quality experience, and that's good on them. And we don't want to stop that from happening, because that is a student playing to their strengths, and we want them to do that. But not everyone's got Uncle Bob. And we need to think about the students that are in that situation, the students who are first in family to university, our international students, students from remote regions, or even marginalised students, cohorts as well. And for those cohorts, we need to be providing additional support and even creating opportunities for the students to have access, at least at some form of equitable level, as those students who have that higher level of social capital. I'm mindful of time, I see it slipping away. I do want to identify that half of the students, and this is a paper published in the special issue in IJ Will on equal access and inclusion. There's a paper there that looked at research that showed that half of the students with disabilities and a third of the students with mental health disabilities are self-selecting out of work-integrated learning. But that research also showed that particularly students with disabilities, they needed some physical accommodations in order to be successful in the workplace, and they were not difficult accommodations to achieve within the workplace. But they're still opting out of because of the fear that they will not be able to achieve successfully their placement. So we've got to provide a little bit more support for those students and have them identify that seeking accommodation where it's needed is not a difficult thing and often very much accepted within the workplace. The other one I want to identify, and I can't unpack in great detail, is it's getting less common, but it's the minimum grade point average requirement in order to be part of a work placement program. From my own experience, academic performance is a pretty poor indicator of the performance of a student in a work placement. In fact, some of the students who are academically struggling tend to be very practical inclined and tend to do very well in a work placement. So having a minimum grade point average as a requirement of taking part, particularly of a work placement program, is an unnecessary barrier that we need to be challenging and removing from our programs. Now, it would be remiss to talk about student experience without also talking about how we can improve student experience. And one of the things that we can certainly focus on is around ensuring that the placement, that the work-integrated learning opportunities are quality experiences. The work-integrated literature is fairly focused on quality at the moment, and Judy Pretty and Matthew Campbell published a great chapter in the International Handbook around quality dimensions of work-integrated learning. I strongly encourage you to read that chapter, and there's additional literature around quality as well that gives some insight on how we can improve the experiences that students have. It's been mentioned already at the conference around the need of having well-resourced programs, and we can always have more resources. That argument is going to be true. But I highlight it in this particular case because many institutions are currently going through some financial constraints around their practice, and as part of that, they are reducing the resourcing in particular areas. But when it comes to work-integrated learning, it's really important that we are well-resourced because these students need to have support. And if we don't provide the level of support that we should, we run the risk of having dangerous practice, and that's not a path that we can go down. Assessment's always been a challenging space, and it's particularly important that we have quality assessment, and the assessment aligns closely to what the student is doing in the workplace, or what we refer to as authentic assessment. And I do want to mention student voice. Now, I know it's been mentioned at the conference already, the importance of student voice. And if we really want to know how to improve student experience, we've got to be asking our students first. But I'm astonished how often I have seen curricular restructuring and redesign where student voice, if it's taken into consideration, is taken into consideration fairly late on in the piece, at which time the ideas about restructuring and the design have already pretty much cemented in. It is too late at that point to have student voice really inform what that new design looks like. So if we're truly interested in improving student experience, then we've got to get that student voice right at the very beginning. Thank you, Michelle. And the last point I want to make here is that a defining element of university education is that it's research-informed education. But you don't have to be a researcher in order to have research-informed education, but you do need to be a consumer of research. And there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of resources available, and I have a list I'll fly through very shortly where you can seek information about how to design and have the research inform your practice. But it's important that we have research-informed practice when it comes to work-integrated learning. So future directions for work-integrated learning. We need to challenge some of the established assumptions that are in place. And I've used the example of the nature of the relationship between the three stakeholders, that we have assumptions around that, but we can go a little bit deeper. It's a lot more complex. And it's important to revisit some of our prior understandings. Because every now and then, those understandings may not be as accurate as what we think it is. And sometimes things have changed. And what was accurate or correct at the time may no longer be the case. Or at the very least, we'll be reaffirming some of our understandings, which is important to do as well. It is important that we ask the difficult questions. Now, I'm sure we're all very good at asking difficult questions, most people are, but when we do so, it is really important that we follow through and find answers for those difficult questions. And that should be our main focus. And that includes asking questions around some of the not so positive aspects of work integrated learning. And we also need to be mindful about considering context for work integrated learning. As I mentioned before, it is very diverse, it is wide and it's varied, but often in the literature, the context of work integrated learning tends to be a little bit generalized, when in fact it can be quite an important contributor towards what is happening for the student experience. And I do want to make some general observations about higher education as a whole, because I honestly think we're in a really interesting time where the relevance of higher education in modern society is being challenged about. And in part that is because the world is changing very fast. And I don't want to sound like an old person when I say that, because the world really is changing really fast. But we're not. We're fairly stagnant in many ways, and universities are notoriously slow to adapt. But when we're in a fast-changing environment, we need to start adapting very quickly as well. I honestly believe that the future higher education is going to look more like that we need more authentic learning through doing, more learning within the changing world rather than alongside the changing world. We definitely have an emphasis on the latter at the moment. There needs to be more blurring between working and learning. And an example I'm bringing here is that degree level apprenticeships, I think it's going to have a really interesting role to play in university education in the future. There needs to be a focus on the ability to source information and particularly be able to discern the quality and the reliability of that information. And there needs to be less emphasis on knowledge transfer, because knowledge is already so readily available, and more around synthesizing and applying that knowledge. Now, if you look at those sort of things, you can see that work integrated learning naturally fits within that. So I wholeheartedly and honestly believe that work integrated learning has a big role to play in the future of higher education. And it's important that we all step up onto that plate. I was going to mention AI. I'm just going to gloss over this because all the universities are struggling with this particular space. Artificial intelligence is going to shape the future of the workplace. As a university, we are preparing students for the future workplace. And if AI is so important in the future workplace, we need to embrace AI as part of our curriculum and student learning. Now, I know that presents challenges, and I don't necessarily know all the answers around that, but I do know if AI is so important in the future, we need to include it in our curriculum. We just have to find a way of making that work. Just a quick gloss over of some of the resources. Hey, I think most of you are already familiar with the International Handbook of Work Integrated Learning. Such a great resource. It is a big resource, very literature rich. Hopefully you already have a copy of that. If not, at least make sure that your university has a copy of it in the library. It really is your first go-to book and resource when it comes to what is established knowledge in work integrated learning. The Advances in Research Theory and Practice, it's a smaller publication, but also really insightful. I encourage you to get a copy or access to a copy of that if you can. And of course, the International Journal for Work Integrated Learning, again, hopefully you all are familiar with that. Open access, free to access, huge amount of resources that sits within it. We've had some really interesting and challenging special issues that have been published in it, including around assessment, research methods, cultural perspectives. Just very recently, we published the Equity, Access and Inclusion special issue, which was a really difficult special issue to publish, but we really wanted to tackle the difficult topics such as equity. And we're currently working on a special issue on well-being. You won't be able to read this, but the slides will be shared later on, so you can pick out the references from there. But there's a vast array of good practice resources and reports available that are freely available, and I encourage you to look those particular ones up. And you would have noticed I've used some references and citations within my slides. They're on the reference list over here. Again, you can't read them, but you can pick them out later on when the slides are shared. There are some really good bedtime reading sitting within there, so please help yourself to those particular resources. And at this point, I'm going to open up for any questions people may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Karsten, for giving us a lot to think about and just for the wonderful synthesis of what's there and your commentary on it as well. I do obviously have a mic. I'm going to run it around for anyone who'd like to ask questions. So who has our first question?
CJ.
I am often in a position of answering to a small but vocal minority who thinks that internships and similar programs will be the death of liberal arts. How should I answer them according to you?
Oh, you know what? I struggle with exactly the same thing. It's the arts and humanities space that is particularly challenging. Not sure if I actually found the answer yet because it's an ongoing problem for us. In our case, work integrated learning is compulsory. So it has to happen, and it's part of the key performance indicators for that particular school. What we're doing is we're investing a lot in them, particularly around helping them design work integrated learning offerings, what it looks like. And to be honest, we're doing a lot of the work for them. But that's not necessarily a bad thing as such, because we're borrowing a lot of work from good practice elsewhere and bringing that across. It is a context that is different. The key thing I would say, and we are making some progress in this area, not everyone needs to be a great lover of work integrated learning. Not everyone needs to like it, and not everyone needs to be involved in it, but you do need to have your champions in that area, and you want to be investing in those champions. So don't be too concerned about having to convert an entire school. You just want to convert enough people who can run the work placement or the work integrated learning program, and then invest in those people. So narrow it down to the ones that do like it, and then just invest yourself into that. But yes, challenging space, and one that we're still working our way through as well. But, and that's far from unique. I know it's true in other areas as well. The other thing I was going to mention, and we've done this, or the school's done that just recently because they know they have to step up in that area. They actually made a particular key appointment in that area too, a young academic who was more open-minded about doing things, and then they offloaded, is probably one way of saying it, but they gave all the work integrated learning responsibilities to that particular new staff member. But that staff member is grabbing it with both hands and developing it further. So a key appointment might be another way of addressing that challenge. Yeah. Good luck for that. Yeah.
Thank you for a very informative talk. You mentioned degree level apprenticeships.
Yeah, yes.
And I come from the UK, where this is particularly a hot topic. Who knows what's going to happen with the new government? We changed our government about 3 weeks ago, so anything could change now. But there's a real tension for us because those degree level apprenticeships are being pushed by that agenda. They are therefore becoming a priority for employers, to the point that we're then struggling to use those spaces for students on traditional programs because they're prioritising those degree level apprenticeship students who technically are employees.
Yeah.
And I work in the healthcare sector where we've got, thousands and thousands of students who are paying for their degree, who deserve to have those opportunities, but can't get a foot in the door because at the end of the day, there's only so much room at the inn. And I just wondered, I suppose it's not really a question, it's a comment as to we need to watch this space and we need to watch it carefully. But how do we maybe push for some investment in some research in this area so that we can do a longitudinal piece of work to really see how that plays out and impacts on what we do?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it is something that we do need to be researching at the same time. And it's kind of presents some really interesting challenges for universities, including some traditional thinking who would want to avoid going down that particular path. It is going to be a change, assuming this does develop further, it is going to be a change on how university operates. And we're going to have shifting of resourcing that's going to happen as in response to that. But I think that's going to be part of how higher education reforms itself in adjusting to what is a very different world than it was some years ago. So how that will look in practice and some of the challenges within, we're going to have to slowly work our way through it. And I'm sure there's going to be additional challenges as well, because it is a major shift on how university may enable learning. And who knows, maybe it will dominate as a model, and maybe it won't. Maybe it will stay a minor model that sits alongside, but only time will tell on that one. But we certainly need to have students more, a curriculum that is more flexible, that allows students to be in the workplace and on campus, or at least learning at the same time. And degree-level apprenticeship is one way of doing it, but there are other models or part-time studies and students doing not necessarily full-level degree-level apprenticeships, but that work integrated learning has expanded to perhaps being a third of the degree, maybe half of the degree. There might be variations in the models that can be looked at as well. But definitely things we need to be looking at, and it's definitely going to present its own challenges as these things continue to grow.
So one of the new trend at least in the United States is that we have a lot of students coming into the college with the college credits already. So with dual enrollment and or AP course credits, right? So they come in, at 17, 18, and they can be junior, right? So they graduate in 2 years or 2.5 years. So by the time they graduate, they're very young. Right? So when those students enroll in those dual experiences and also getting a job, they're awfully young. And the challenge is how can they expect to receive the respect they deserve that often attached to their age? And because as an employer, often we hear from them how it's really hard to treat them not like children when they are like 18. Right, and I think that is an important thing. So, what recommendations might you have for both employer side and the students to create the space where the respect of paid at least internship, right, can be expected and then demanded out of the employers?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, first we need to acknowledge that the student who's in the workplace is there as a learner. So that they are learning within that context, and yes, that they are working there as well, but there is that interesting interplay that they're a learner at the same time. I think it's incredibly important, and this should be part of good practice, that there should always be respect between all of the stakeholders, and that includes the student no matter what their age is. Now, I would imagine that most employers will be pretty open-minded about being respectful to people in the workplace, that there are requirements around that. But it may very well be that some of those things is best addressed when applying, creating some resources around good practice when it comes to workplace supervisors and how they support and mentor a student. I know some of the discussions we had earlier, I think it might have been Dave Drury that were part of, maybe Anne, you're working on that at Waterloo around developing a resource about what is good practice of workplace supervision. And within that, you can structure wordings around how the students should be treated, how they should be respected, but at the same time, what their level of role and status, if that's the right word to use, is within the workplace. So there are ways of managing that. But the word that keeps coming to my mind is that mutual respect that's got to be in place. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. So.
Thank you, and thanks for this really thorough and fascinating research. I was really struck by your data about students reporting being stressed about COVID, the state of the world, their physical health, taking care of family members, and the juxtaposition of that with your comment that you question any part of the curriculum that does not contribute to employability. And I'm wondering if don't you think that the university and even in work integrated learning broadly as well, shouldn't that help students grapple with these things that are outside of whether they're employable or not? They may have to do with work too, but there seems to be more to life than employability that we may want to educate students to deal with.
Yes, no, I'm glad you asked that question because I hadn't quite had time to unpack that further. Yes, students encounter stress that is not necessarily work-related. It may affect the things that they do within work, and we need to be mindful about how we support them. But it's the work of DC that comes to mind, the self-determination theory, that students successfully conquering, if that's the right word to it, successfully managing stress, and as a successful way from them building up resilience. So even though severe stress is not a positive thing, low-level stress and successfully managing that is a way of building up resilience. And I think for the future, when we look at students going into the workplace, we really do need to focus on enabling more resilience and having some sort of resilience education for students before they go into the workplace, but also afterwards. Because these stresses they'll encounter, they are real stresses. They'll encounter them also after they graduate. It is a normal part of life. And we need to learn to navigate our way around that. But it's important that we support our students as part of that. So successfully overcoming, so stress is not always a bad thing. That's the point I wanted to make. Low-level stress can be good, can even increase productivity according to DC's work. But it needs to be supported appropriately so the students can be successful in managing that. Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Thank you, Karsten, for a wonderful closing keynote. Please join me in expressing appreciation for all this food for thought.